So from a comm law perspective, and thinking of terms of ethics, how could we better prepare ourselves when we're in a situation with an employer or even a professor where we're feeling something might be a little ethically challenging to us?
I think, so there are obviously ethical answers to that. In terms of law, there are two things that I teach in my common law class for PR students specifically. And they're both ways that you can kind of give your employer, colleague, or whatever, kind of more of a concrete, like, hey, this is more than just ethics, this is law kind of answer. One of them is from a case called Nike v. Caskey, and this was a case that was decided by the California Supreme Court, and it actually went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they were going to take it and hear it, and then at the last minute they decided, I think they decided they just didn't want to have that kind of decision on the record, so they sent it back down. So it only applies to California, but we do have a California Supreme Court precedent that I think PR students should know about. So Nike v. Caskey was a case where Nike was sending out a lot of PR stuff. I think it was taking out ads in magazines to address criticisms of sweatshops that it had through its different vendors internationally, and underage labor and abuses in the sweatshops, etc. And Nike lied. It lied in its PR expression, in its its communications, its corporate communications. And so a guy named Mark Caskey, under this California law that we have, sued Nike, saying that, you know, Nike's expression here, its PR expression, was basically for the purpose of making money for the company, right? You're trying to protect your reputation, etc. And California Supreme Court's justices ruled that speech, while it's considered political speech for the U.S. Supreme Court, which basically means, as far as our U.S. Constitution goes, PR speech is political speech. But in California, the California Supreme Court ruled that it was commercial speech, which puts it more on the level of advertising, which is much easier to regulate. And in fact, it was false commercial speech, which means it's unprotected by the First Amendment. And so that was their interpretation of it. What that means for PR people is, if someone in your company is encouraging you to put out stuff that is not true, which eventually is going to bite you in the ass anyway, that something you can say is, in California, this is actually considered commercial speech. In other words, it's not fully protected. And so someone could actually sue us. And you can bring up the Nike case. If you forget everything else, Nike sweatshops, Nike had to pay. And so, you know, bring that up, and that might be a little bit more convincing than just your opinion. So that's one thing. Another thing that only applies to any of you who end up working in a publicly traded company. In other words, a company that's publicly traded on the stock market. If you're working for a company like that, that has to follow what are called SEC rules regarding shareholders and basically disclosing anything that a shareholder would want to know if they were going to try to either sell or buy any stocks of yours. And that's pretty broad. You generally want to know what a company is up to, if it's had oil spills, if it's had lawsuits, et cetera, et cetera. So what that rule says, under what's called 10 Rule B-5 of the Securities and Exchange Act, you are actually required by law to, in a timely manner, disclose anything that shareholders or potential shareholders would want to know about your company. And so that means pretty much anything that probably would fall under the things that maybe someone in your company might not want to have out there, things that are not the greatest things to have out there. Those of you who are PR students have, of course, learned all the way through that it's better for you to control the story and be transparent than to try to hide it, because it's eventually going to come out. And obviously that's what you should tell someone, but if that's not enough and you're working for a publicly traded company, you can say, this is a matter of federal law. Federal law actually requires us to tell the press in a timely manner, because the press is a proxy for the public. And so that can really help you. And a friend of mine who was working for Mercedes-Benz International, USA International, I think is the name of it, which is a U.S. branch of Mercedes-Benz. That company had just become a publicly traded company that year, and so I was telling her, because she was complaining that she was constantly having to try to tell her employers to be more transparent and be more forthcoming. I was like, just tell them Rule 10b-5, like federal law. And she was so excited, and she used it. It was actually really effective for her to push back when people in the company were telling her that it would be better to be less than transparent, which, in addition to being strategically weak, is also not ethical.
Mm-hmm. So how would you encourage someone in our position, our age, just out of college and a new job, to take that extra step when we know it's ethically wrong, but to encourage our employers, because we are in such a vulnerable new position? Most of us will be in new jobs. So what would you say to encourage them to, know their rights and push back, like you said?
I think, like I said, I think those two things can help you add a little bit more to just sounding like an idealistic newbie, and in general, the more specific that you can be about making an argument, the arguments I'm sure you guys have learned constantly in your classes for why strategically it's better. I'm sad to say that oftentimes ethical arguments are not going to be the strongest arguments. It's more likely to hold water if you give a more strategic reason why it will be smarter, and maybe accompany it with not just, hey, generally it would be strategically smarter, but give them specifically what the strategic plan would be to control that story, or to get that story out there and make the company look like a good guy. And honestly, I have to wonder at this point if, and I think you guys as PR people are more likely to know this with your socialization in this discipline, if the idea of being honest and authentic as a company wouldn't actually be refreshing. I know that probably sounds completely idealistic, but it's so unusual these days. And there are examples that you guys have learned about, and you can use those examples too, where a company has done well by being transparent, by saying we're sorry, and then actually taking measures to make up for what they've done. I think more than ever, I think your generation cares about at least the ethical public face of your company. So, for example, when Nike decided to, use Colin Kaepernick in its ads, you guys know this, it did it because your generation is what it wants. It doesn't want the old people. It doesn't care. If the old people are mad about it, that's fine. It wants the younger generation, and Nike knew that. And so the same kind of thing goes for strategically. If you're working for a company and you're talking about millennials or Gen Z, I think they are going to respond more to transparency and authenticness and, and actual measures taken to make up for any problems that they've created.
Mm-hmm. Okay, just a couple more questions. Is it for us ethically responsible? Maybe our employer is saying this information is not to be disseminated, and we're saying,
oh, whistleblower,
maybe we need to publish it. And maybe it's not to the extent of like whistleblowing on a company, but like I can't not share that information.
That's actually a great question, Nikki. There you go. There's a common law question I can help you with. Okay, so one, leaking stuff is actually, I don't know if you guys are learning it in class, but leaking is a PR strategy at this point, right? Are you guys learning that?
Yeah.
But leaking has been like a straightforward strategic PR move for increasingly over the last couple of decades. And sometimes even like that's exactly what the company wants to have happen. Like it will leak something but be like, I don't know how you got that, but but it actually it helps the company to do that. So one, that's actually a tactic, and two, If you're talking about like whistleblower leaking, in other words, you know something that the company is refusing to release, but you feel like the public does need to know it. One, legally, I should tell you that that whistleblowers, we've been talking about strengthening whistleblower protection for so long, both at federal and state levels, and I think California has something, but you would have to check me on that. Anyway, so you should know that as a whistleblower, you should probably try to figure out exactly what the laws are, because whistleblowers are not protected. Now, what is protected by the First Amendment is if someone publishes what you leak. So, in other words, whoever publishes it will be protected by the First Amendment, but the leaker is not. So make sure you get away with it.
So cover your tracks, that's what
cover your tracks. And I do mean that ethically. I mean, if there is something that, if you're working for a company and you know that there's something that that the public has a right to know, wow, this is really subversive, isn't it? Yeah, be careful. Be careful, because it's not good to be you when you get found out. But it is important, and that is why anyone who publishes it is protected by the First Amendment. And increasingly these days, I think that whistleblowing and leaking, they can be used for good and evil, right? Whistleblowing generally is considered you're trying to protect the public or something, but I think that leaking and whistleblowing is all the more important today because PR has become so effective. PR has become so ubiquitous. And companies do know that they can't be scrutinized if no one knows what they've done. And so I think that as a tactic, as an ethical tactic, I think it's more important than ever. But whoever is leaking is, if the company sues them or what have you, they're not going to be protected by the First Amendment, right. unless there's really strong whistleblower laws in the state. And we have a federal whistleblower act. I just don't think it's as strong as it ought to be.